Dr. Lester Kurtz is professor of sociology at George Mason University, where he teaches public sociology, social movements, conflict, comparative religions, and theory. He holds an MAR from Yale and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He has edited the 3-volume Encyclopedia of Violence, Peace, and Conflict and co-edited Nonviolent Social Movements and The Web of Violence. Other books include Gods in the Global Village, The Nuclear Cage, and The Politics of Heresy, which received the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion's Distinguished Book Award. Dr. Kurtz is past chair of the Peace and Justice Studies Association and the Peace, War, and Social Conflict section of the American Sociological Association, which also awarded him its Distinguished Career Award. He has lectured in Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America, and taught at the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, Delhi University, Tunghai University, and the European Peace University. He is on the Academic Advisory Board of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. At this point, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Les Kurtz.
Hi, thanks, Darren, and hello, everybody. Hi, Mom. I think my mother's out there. At least I know somebody's listening. So look forward to having this opportunity to work with you on this topic for a few minutes today. From Bull Connor's dogs and fire hoses attacking U.S. civil rights demonstrators to the massacre at Amritsar in colonial India, the use of coercive force often backfires, and rather than stopping dissidents, repression often ironically fuels resistance, and it undercuts the legitimacy of a regime, sort of pulling down its pillars of support. And that's what we want to focus on today. There's a long scholarly tradition, really, that explores the unanticipated consequences of martyrdom, other acts of violence, and so on. Lee Smithy at Swarthmore College and I have been working on this for a while. We believe that this is something that should get more attention from movement scholars, from activists, from the general public, how efforts by regimes to oppress movements or people in power to oppress movements often mobilize popular support for the movement and actually undermine the authorities' legitimacy, potentially leading to significant reforms or even the overthrow of the regime. So we want to look at how activists engage in repression management, how they can prepare for it, can frame and respond to repression in a way that can enhance their own mobilization and increase support for their movement in the broader culture, in the media, sometime even within the ruling regime itself. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we'll explore especially these methods and tactics deployed, some of the cultural frames, their consequences, and that sort of thing. So here's the point. Repression and repressive coercion can paradoxically empower a movement and even weaken a regime or people in power. So the empowerment happens often because of identity shifts. The movement participants increase the intensity of their attachments when they become attacked by people in power. Then they shift their identity attachments more toward the movement. And third parties may become disaffected with the system. People who are, for example, white people in South Africa who began to question the system when they saw other white people being beaten by police while they were at prayer, that sort of thing. So this can weaken a regime. It can turn public opinion against the ruling party or the ruling powers. It can even promote internal dissent among the elites, sometimes even military and police. So here's the kind of overall framework. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these because we only have a few minutes, and I want to leave some time for discussion at the end. But I'll lay out the general idea at the beginning, then I'm going to look at a few different types of repression with some historical examples, and then talk more explicitly about repression management, how various groups, movements have tried to manage the repression that they faced how they can frame the repression, how they can align their movement's frame with other people's frame to draw them in or at least gain their sympathy. And we'll look at this whole notion of identity construction, about people's sense of identity, who they are, who they connect with, who they are related to. Dramatic realization, that is making things that are otherwise unapparent apparent. And then briefly, lessons for scholars and activists, and then our more general discussion. So first of all, this notion of the paradoxes of repression, especially when there's some kind of asymmetrical conflict between people in power and people out of power. When force is used to repress the dissidents, it often backfires against the repressor. And this is frequently a turning point in the history of the movement. It involves performance, it involves moral outrage, expressions of moral outrage that are based on shared norms that people often have, norms of fair play, of good governance, of proportionate response. William Gamson, social movement scholar, sociologist, talks about the importance of the injustice frame and of movements making sure that people see the injustice that they're feeling. Now, this has kind of a long history. I already mentioned, of course, the interest in martyrdom, and so people have understood this for centuries, if not millennia. But it's a more current understanding of the idea of backfire, or the paradox of repression we're talking about today. Richard Gregg used the term moral jiu-jitsu in a book in the 30s about Gandhi, and Gene Sharp picked that up and talked about political jiu-jitsu. This is a kind of a martial arts metaphor. When someone attacks you, instead of trying to meet them head on, force with force, you use their force, like to flip them over, like the two men in the frame at the top there. Brian Martin picked up on this and called it backfire, and wrote some ideas about backfire. I'll give you some references here, and you can follow up on them later if you're interested. Lee Smithy and I talk about this as the paradox of repression, and Brian Martin talks about backfire as an attack that creates more support for or attention to whatever is attacked. So any injustice or norm violation can backfire on the perpetrator, the person who is doing the attacking. So some of the sources of what I'm going to talk about today: Gene Sharp's Methods of Nonviolent Action, which is a kind of summary of some of the best scholarship and thinking about nonviolent action more generally, nonviolent struggle. Some papers Lee and I have been working on. Actually, the most recent one he's delivering at the International Studies Association sometime this week. So we have a fresh version of this, Repression Management and the Arts of Nonviolent Strategy. If you're interested in any of these papers, just or have comments or ideas, feel free to email me, just lkurtz@gmu for George Mason University. And then there's an article, very interesting article online, David Hess and Brian Martin. You can look at this at my PowerPoints afterward if you can't get this all copied down, if you want to follow up on them. Then a couple of other things that we published, Lee Smithy and I have published over the years. Now, there are a couple of possible conditions that Brian Martin suggests, and here's a link to some of his articles on backfire. An action is perceived as unjust, unfair, excessive, or disproportional. This seems to be one of the first criteria for backfire coming into place. And secondly, this information gets communicated to relevant audiences. So there's really no consensus among scholars. Lee and I have been looking at some of these various studies of repression. There's not a great deal of consensus, although there are some interesting patterns. Sometimes repression does diminish protest, and we're not completely sure, I don't think, about how it is that a movement can be eliminated or disabled by repression, but sometimes it does work. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Or it may facilitate movement organizing, and some studies show that. Or sometimes the relationship is kind of U-shaped. If there's not much repression, or if there's a whole lot of repression, is a different kind of consequence than when you have just a sort of minimal amount of, or a certain amount of repression. So here are some of the possible determining factors as to the outcome of repression, whether repression is going to harm a movement or help it. The first one is often called by movement scholars, it's called political opportunity. That is, if there are moments when a regime is weak or some event occurs that opens things up, so on, then the notion of labeling, where dissidents are actually created by labeling activists and thus radicalizing them. This is something I discovered years ago when I was looking at a reform movement in the Roman Catholic Church. The movement was actually, in a sense, created by the Pope, who started denouncing certain scholars who then started getting together to protect themselves, and they created a movement as a consequence of the repression. The temporal location in the cycle of protest. When does the repression occur? What kind of movement organizing has happened before and after? Where is the conflict in its cycle? Presence and nature of networks. What kinds of social networks, networks among activists and so on. And a lot of our focus is on repression as an opportunity and the role of the activists in being able to actually to deal with repression when it happens. Now, let me talk a little bit about some types of repression that sometimes backfire. And I'll say a little bit and give you some examples of each one of these: massacres, assassinations, executions, martyrdoms, arrests, military coups, memorials, violence against demonstrators, torture, disappearances, election fraud. These are just, it is not comprehensive, just some examples of some of the kinds of things that happen. Now let me start with what may be the real classic case here, and that is the Amritsar massacre in 1919. Some of you may have seen, many of you may have seen Attenborough's film Gandhi, because there's a recreation of both ends of this in that film. A nice recreation. Although it's unpleasant to watch, the Amritsar massacre. Many of you know the story. There's a gathering of people to protest during the Indian freedom movement in the early stages of the movement. This is actually not too long after Gandhi has returned from South Africa and started getting involved in the movement. The Quit India movement. And a group of demonstrators are inside, and the British troops block off the entrance or the exit to this courtyard area. They open fire. There's no place for the protesters to go, to escape, and several hundred are killed, many more injured, and this becomes really a major turning point in the history of the Indian freedom movement. Many people began to question much more deeply the legitimacy of the British control of India and so on. Now Gandhi picks up on this sentiment, this dissent that's generated by the Amritsar massacre, actually 10 years later in 1930, when he organizes the famous Salt March to seize initiative from the British, because in fact what he does is he marches around 240 miles over a several-day period, and the crowd gathers and so on. He arrives at the Indian Ocean, and in this dramatic moment he picks up salt from the ocean, from the seashore, and breaks this law about salt. But it's not just about salt, although that has a lot of symbolic meaning. and the British control over something as basic as salt. But it also happens on the anniversary of the Amritsar massacre. And so he is also dramatizing the injustice of that event at the same time. Again, we could find other examples of massacres that have backfired, have generated great outrage, and so on. A similar event in India, colonial India, is the Kissa Kane massacre in Peshawar, in the northwest frontier colonies. Now, usually when I talk about this, I'm trying to anticipate some of the questions here, because I almost always get a question about Tiananmen Square. What about Tiananmen Square? Didn't the Chinese movement, the Chinese troops crush the student movement in Tiananmen Square in 1989? And well, yes, although we have this wonderful image, which I have a YouTube link here, but apparently our technology of the webinar won't allow us to really show it effectively. So if you want to watch it, you can just Google it on YouTube, or go to YouTube and search for it, or else you can look at my PowerPoint and see the link. This seems to be a counterexample, but here's what happened. Actually, I interviewed Yan Jiaqi, who was head of the Beijing Academy of Political Sciences at the time of the student demonstration, and he set up a school for democracy on the square. I interviewed him a number of years later in Taiwan, in fact, and he pointed out that the massacre on June 4th actually set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire in the following months. Because if you remember, that was the beginning of June, and it's in the fall of 1989. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall as the kind of iconic event of that period. But this all happened in the fall, and in fact, East German President Honecker called for a Chinese solution to the growing protests in his own country, and his security chief response is, "Eric, we can't beat up hundreds of thousands of people." So even his own security chief realized the problems with that solution, and so in fact, the wall comes down in Berlin on November 9th. Just a few months after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And in fact, part of what is going on is that Mikhail Gorbachev is highly embarrassed by Tiananmen Square. He refuses to send troops to repress dissidents in the empire. After he comes back from a visit to East Germany, he writes in his memoirs, he thought, "Thank God the new East German leadership had the courage and enough common sense to refrain from trying to quelch the popular unrest in blood." And in fact, his foreign minister, Gerasimov, announced on the 25th of October what he himself called the Sinatra Doctrine, do it my way. He said Central and East European countries should figure out their own way of dealing with uprisings and protests without Soviet interference. So by sort of pulling the plug on Soviet involvement, as a consequence, in many ways, of the disaster of Tiananmen Square that Gorbachev saw, and even the delegitimation of communism to some extent worldwide, which was something that he was trying to rescue, in a sense. Okay, let's move on to another fun topic, assassinations, executions, and martyrdoms. One of the most well-known, of course, is the civil rights workers, the Birmingham bombings, and so on. I'll say some more about the civil rights movement in a moment. But in 1986, one of the first of the sort of people power revolutions that we've seen a lot of in recent decades was initiated to some extent by the assassination of the most prominent dissident, Benigno Aquino. And in fact, his wife ended up being elected president of the Philippines through this people power uprising in 1986. Of course, we have Bloody Sunday. This is something that Lee Smithy has done some research on, the conflict, the troubles in Northern Ireland, of which Bloody Sunday was oftentimes the kind of icon. And of course, this goes all the way back to Jesus, who is our archetypical martyr in the sense. His death helps to precipitate the creation of the church. We're all familiar, of course, with Rosa Parks and her arrest in Montgomery, beginning the civil rights movement in the United States. But there are also a number of other movements that were in some ways sparked by arrests. Gandhi in South Africa, his arrest in 1906 after he called on September 11th for a nonviolent resistance campaign against new laws requiring all Indians in the country to carry a pass, and a number of other things. Adolfo Perez Esquivel, the mobilization of an organization in the service of peace and justice, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and part of his movement was spawned by his arrest. In Berlin, during the Nazi period, there's a group of men who were arrested because they were Jewish. Their wives showed up at the police station and refused to leave until their husbands were released, and in fact, they eventually were. Cesar Chavez and the migrant farm workers, the United Farm Workers, again in the United States, used arrests very strategically to try to build support for their movement. Another kind of repression that's significant, military coup d'etat in the Soviet Union in 1991, efforts by the hardliners within the Soviet Union who were upset with Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost his reforms, and they were in effect outmaneuvered by protesters in the street, responding to and refusing to accept a military coup that was taking place. Similarly, in Thailand, a military coup sparked a lot of popular protests and eventually the restoration of democracy. Memorials, remembering significant people, significant events, sometimes of past repressions. Again, Gandhi's use of Amritsar as a kind of public memory, and the Czech and Hungarian revolutions of 1989. There was a funeral for Jan Palach. Funerals often become moments of expression of dissent, especially in places where you can't just go out on the streets and demonstrate, because it's hard for the authorities to shut down a funeral, and sometimes even memorials that are sort of retrospective funerals like Jan Palach's in 1989. Then we have violent attacks on demonstrators. There's a wonderful film, a documentary that I wish I could show you a clip of, but you can take a look at it. There's a link to the YouTube selection from it that shows Bull Connor sort of dripping with racist comments, and then the attack dogs, the fire hoses, and so on, that becomes an extremely significant moment in the civil rights movement. Wenceslas Swear in Prague in 1989, where students are attacked. There is a rumor that one of the students has been killed, and it turned out not to be true. A lot of still some mystery around that event, but even the rumor of the death and the beating of student demonstrators at that time was what led to this enormous outpouring of dissent and people in the streets and organized organized resistance to the Czechoslovakian government, and the election of Václav Havel as who had been the prominent dissident playwright as president of the country. In Tbilisi, Georgia, 1991, Soviet troops fired on the demonstrators, and this helped to spur on resistance against the Soviet Union from within the country. Again, the notion of torture and disappearance. Sorry, I was trying to get rid of those before we started our session. The demonstrations against torture and disappearance. One of the most well-known, the Mothers of the Disappeared in Argentina, who began showing up in the square wearing scarves with the names of their missing sons embroidered on their scarves. And you know, again, it's difficult to arrest a woman wearing a scarf because it has her son's name on it. But this became the focus of a movement that actually continued to swell and grow and bring in other sectors of society, resulted in the resignation of the Argentinian generals and the restoration of democracy there. In Chile, during the reign of Pinochet, Serpa organized public demonstrations against his practices of disappearing his opposition. They marched in the street chanting protests against that, and it helped to become an issue that they rallied around. Election fraud is another major issue. Philippines in 1986, the People Power movement responds to Marcos' effort to steal the election. In Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic tries to steal an election, and the opposition is prepared. Otpor and the democratic opposition of Serbia have election monitors at polling places, a network of emails to tally the results, and then there's a mobilization of resistance afterwards that ends up forcing Milosevic to resign. A wonderful film, Bringing Down a Dictator. You can find details about it at the ICNC website, nonviolent-conflict.org. And then, of course, we have Iran in 2009. We don't know how that one's going to turn out yet. Obviously, a difficult situation. But again, election fraud became an issue that helped us to spur the movement on. So, what about this whole question of repression management? How can movements manage the kind of repression that they are facing to their advantage? And this is kind of a corollary to Irving Goffman, a well-known sociologist who does sort of sociology of everyday life. And he talks about impression management, about how people play various roles and they manage impressions that people have of them and so on. This is sort of at the core of our daily lives. And so we're kind of picking up on his idea, but talking about repression management in this case. So how do dissident movements frame and respond to repression in order to, first of all, enhance recruitment among sympathetic publics or potentially sympathetic publics, secondly, to evoke support from external third parties, and then finally even to foster factions and mutinies within the elites and security forces. This is, again, oftentimes a key moment in a movement's history, especially if there's a serious confrontation between activists and state, or an oppressive state. Many times, we were just talking about Milosevic, for example, many times, such as in Serbia, where the people are sent in, the troops are sent in to handle the situation, to turn back demonstrators, and many of them not only refuse to fire, but sometimes even turn on their fellow officers. and this is often an important thing. This happens in many ways because of responses to repression and how it's been managed. That has them begin to question the system that they're upholding. Now, management management may actually be too precise a term. It has a kind of bureaucratic sound to it. Although I like the idea of repression management. Excuse me. But in some ways, this is kind of an art. Managing repression may be more of an art than a business. And it involves dramaturgical tactics and the art of impression management. Jeffrey Alexander writes about cultural pragmatics, and we find his work really helpful for thinking about this. Or even the idea of sort of choreography, and this is what Gandhi did with the Salt March. He, in a sense, kind of choreographed repression management. Now, if we had more time, I'd go into more detail on this, but I'm going to just mention it and move on. Relational theories of power is part of where this notion of repression management is coming from. And there's oftentimes not enough attention paid to the idea of agency, of the ability of actors to change structures and so on. And the power available to opposition groups is often overlooked, and the idea that power is actually embedded in relationships. All domination, Georg Simmel, German sociologist from early 20th century, said, domination is really a form of interaction. Conflict is a form of interaction. And as Gandhi reminds us, even the most powerful dictator cannot remain in power without the consent of the governed. Václav Havel picked up on this with his notion of the power of the powerless, where he talked about the withdrawal of consent, picking up on Gandhi's writings, refusing to help enact the relationship between the dominant and the oppressed, refusing to allow the intended consequences of repression from playing out, in a sense. So this leads us to our sort of last kind of theoretical issue here, and that is the whole notion of framing. And there's been some interesting work on this among movement scholars, especially Rob Benford and Dave Snow, the sort of rhetorical practices that movement leaders use to frame, to create schemata that resonate with cultures and ideologies, and that mobilize potential recruits. They sustain collective action. They keep people moving, in a sense. And there are three basic framing tasks that a movement faces. And this is helpful, I think, for looking at how movements can in fact manage repression that they face and turn it to their advantage. Diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational are the three main tasks. The diagnostic is the what's wrong question. You go to the doctor diagnoses what your illness is. What is it that's causing your symptoms? So the diagnostic framing identifies the changes that need to be made. It shows linkages between repression and the problems in the system, dramatizes the injustice, and then sort of choreographs some kind of heightening of this gap between what should happen and what shouldn't. Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech is an excellent example of how this is done. The prognostic frame then talks about what should be done. Okay, what change needs to take place? What effect will various strategies and tactics have? How should we go about addressing this problem that we've noticed with the diagnosis? And then finally, motivational framing. How do we get people to act? How do we mobilize them? How do we find appropriate vocabularies of motive, ways of talking about what needs to be done and how to do it? Severity, urgency, efficacy, propriety. What are the words that a movement can use to try to get people actually acting. Part of what's going on here is this notion of frame alignment processes, of aligning the movement's frame with frames that exist out there in the general public or among certain audiences that the movement is trying to address. Frame bridging, which links the movement's frame to other frames in the society. Frame amplification, which is sort of an embellishment or an invigoration of existing values or beliefs, trying to get people to see what's happening within the movement as something that they already believe in. Frame extension, sort of extending someone else's frames or extending the movement's frames to include other issues so everyone benefits. Frame transformation, changing old understandings and meanings in order to generate new ones. Dr. King sort of baptized Gandhi for the civil rights movement. He took Gandhi's ideas, which were multi-religious, multi-faith in their rhetoric, but had a strong Hindu and Muslim and sort of Buddhist Jain content. And Dr. King gave them a sort of explicit Christian rhetoric in order to connect to his largely Christian audience. Okay, real briefly, so we can move to discussion, let me just mention the idea of identity construction, repression management. Oftentimes, people in a movement, once they've been attacked, will begin to have a stronger sense of belonging to the movement. It may radicalize the participants. And then we have this idea of dramatic realization. The Goffman says you infuse activity with signs that dramatically highlight and portray facts otherwise unapparent. Here Gandhi talks about the need of the civil resistor to provoke, to actually, in a sense, to sort of provoke a response at points. Well, we need a lot more research, I think, on this kind of phenomenon. If you have ideas, we would love to hear from you, either today or later. One idea, for example, Wendell Fogg has a marvelous article where we can change the repertoire of various aspects of a conflict. So how can repression management change these various aspects of a conflict? Basically the journalist questions, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. So hope to get your ideas. Lee and I are actually trying to edit a volume on this topic. If you have studies that are relevant or ideas, things that you've read, things that we could follow up on, we would love to hear from you now or later. So that's it for now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz. And maybe you could provide your email address one more time if there are participants who would like to share with you some of their own research or ideas. Go ahead with your email address.
Yes, it's lkurtz@gmu.edu.
Great.
GMU for George Mason University.
Great, thanks. And I also want to reiterate that if you have any comments or questions about this webinar topic, you can, of course, email Dr. Kurtz directly, but we also encourage you to email webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org. And we have folks here who would like to respond to some of those questions, and of course we would forward them along to Dr. Kurtz. But anyway, at this point, I'd like to take questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can type it into the question dialog box, which is on your control panel, or you can click the little raise hand button, and then you'll show up on my screen, and I will unmute you. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself and go ahead and ask your question, and Dr. Kurtz will respond. So please go ahead and raise your hand if you have any questions. And as people are thinking, there are a couple people have posted questions in the dialog box, so I can read a couple of those. The first one we have, Dr. Kurtz, is from Rama Kudami, And he writes, what about when those employing repression have no concern for legitimacy because of the guaranteed support of a third party?
Right. That's a good question, and it's. I wish we could dialogue on it a little bit to find out more exactly what is meant by a third party. But clearly, there are times when you just can't reach the people in power, and you can't expect them to come around to your side, even though that's what Gandhi was constantly moving toward. It didn't always work, even for him. But I think part of what we have to remember too is that basically when there's a need for change, you can either do something or not do something. And then if you decide that you want to do something, it involves risks, and you have choices of strategies. And my own feeling is that we always have to remember that we have choices between violent and nonviolent methods of action, and that violence doesn't always work either. Neither does nonviolent action. I think that part of what happens, in fact, is if you use violent strategies to try to bring about some kind of change, you may lose an opportunity to manage repression, because the people in power really don't have any constraints on what they're doing. So yeah, of course we shot them. They showed up with guns. Whereas a lot of times what happens really with nonviolent movements when they're attacked is that there are other people in civil society, or people even outside of the country, who can see it. Now this works a lot. Sometimes it doesn't. Burma, Myanmar, maybe one example that people would have in mind, where it seems like the people in power don't seem to care that much about what everyone else thinks.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz. And again, I would encourage our attendees to just click that raise hand button. We'd like to hear your voice, not just read your words. So click that raise hand button, and I will unmute you, and you can ask your question directly to Dr. Kurtz. But actually, Dr. Kurtz, you mentioned something that another one of our attendees, Rolf Carriere, wrote. He said, would Burma be another counterexample, or should the Burmese population and the monks need to wish for more repression before liberation can occur there?
Wow, that's a difficult question. Yeah, it's I think wishing for more repression is not a good idea. Certainly in a case like Burma, where they have been hit very hard already by the by the authorities, and it's hard to imagine more repression being more helpful. I think that part of what happens is we have to remember a longer time frame, and this is certainly my impression of what the monks have in mind, who are taking on the Burmese generals. That as well as Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, who has suffered for many years in house arrest. How many years was Nelson Mandela in jail? How many years did the Indian independence movement struggle before independence occurred? These things are usually not done overnight, although there are these sort of spectacular moments in history when everything falls into place. Even that is usually the result of lots of hard work and organizing, building up of an infrastructure, networks of resistance prior to these dramatic explosions into the public, like the people power movement in the Philippines and so on. So I wouldn't give up on the monks in Burma. I don't think they have, and I would hope that we would still see some kind of resolution of that, positive resolution.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Israel Alonso, and he writes, he'd like you to speak a little bit more about the Cuba situation. And maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have enough enough knowledge of it, of what's actually going on there in terms of kind of resistance movement. I mean, it does seem like there has been a lot of hope for possibility of change, and I know that there are people organizing a resistance within Cuba with the waning of Castro's power. It does seem like there's more of an opening at this point, but I'm not familiar enough with the details. Wish I could answer that better, but I can't.
Okay, great, thank you. And again, if you have any questions you'd like to pose vocally over your phone or over your computer, Mike, just click that raise hand button and I'll unmute you. Our next question here comes from Carlos Moreno, and he asks, how does the paradox of repression appear during a civil war?
Well, I guess, part of, my emphasis tends to be on nonviolent struggle and what nonviolent movements have done to respond to repression and use it for their own good. But obviously in a civil war, part of, or any kind of militarized conflict, really, part of what happens is that when the repression is not total and the battle rages, then people use the repression as an excuse for more violence, right? I mean, it's sort of the narratives about how horribly they've treated us, this sort of injustice frame, certainly can be used to mobilize violence as well. And in the Civil War, we certainly see that going on, or any kind of strife within a given region. I mean, clearly the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians involves a lot of use of sort of what some people call atrocity tales, right? Where you mobilize action by pointing out atrocities committed to our side by their side, and this happens, of course, on both sides. So I guess it can be a tool used within a violent conflict. Although, again, I think that a nonviolent movement has a kind of upper hand strategically in this area, because it can say, we weren't causing any harm, but we were just there presenting our grievances in a peaceful manner, and suddenly they attacked us, and this gives a kind of credibility that I think begins to eat away at the legitimacy of the power structure.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here, hand raised, from Philippe Duhamel. So I'll go ahead and unmute you, and you could introduce yourself and go ahead with your question, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm basically an organizer of nonviolent direct action campaigns, and I'm also a consultant working, unfortunately, with the ICNC. And I've been increasingly intrigued by some of the ways that skillful organizers seem to be able to, I'd say, stage calibrated provocations, in the sense that Gandhi says is a key duty of civil resistors. And I think we've seen Martin Luther King do this with SCLC when they chose to target Birmingham after failures in Albany, or relative failures, or James Farmer saying, we're going to stage the freedom rides, and we're counting on the bigots to create the crisis that is going to do the work for us. So I'm interested and curious to know what would be sort of the conditions that you see for the skillful design of actions that work as a kind of well-calibrated provocation for backfire?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think, this again is I think it's partly a matter of back to the issue of the arts. And my guess is you probably know well as an organizer yourself that much of this, because there are tremendous risks in that kind of provocation strategy, and because in fact people may very well get hurt, and then this also raises, of course, the ethical questions. Are we actually causing harm, even harm of our own people, to use this kind of strategy? But and I think a lot of it has to do with being extremely creative in responding to a particular situation, and of coming up with ways of engaging the powers you're trying to resist in a creative way. And there's not sort of a cookbook. Now there is a process, and one of the best things I've seen is the Canvas core curriculum. If you I'm sure you're familiar with that, but if people are not, they can find it on the internet. Just Canvas, CANVAS, core, CORE curriculum, and you can download a copy of this guide, and it takes you through sort of step-by-step process, strategic process, a larger strategic process for movement planning and strategic planning for a movement. And I think that you can use that. That process can also be applied to the kind of sort of provocative things that you're talking about. So, for example, you look at the pillars of support of the people you're up against, and you try to figure out, okay, where are they vulnerable? What kinds of actions could we take that would, on the one hand, provoke the authorities to act against us in a repressive way, that would also, on the other hand, the injustice would appear obvious to the people we're trying to influence to come over to our side, or at least be sympathetic to our cause. So for example, one of my favorites in the film Bringing Down a Dictator is the folks from Otpor in Serbia, because I've just been writing some about them, and there's some wonderful strategies that they use with a kind of public mocking of Milosevic and the dictatorship that are kind of playful, and when people are arrested doing this kind of sort of public theater or having concerts that people are enjoying, especially if you have the proper representation. Rosa Parks was not the first person arrested for not moving to the back of the bus, but she was the right person to organize a movement around. So it involves that kind of careful assessment of the situation and how people might respond to it, a sort of reflexivity about it.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and I have a question written in here by Olorotimi Taiwo, but I'm going to unmute you and give you an opportunity to ask the question yourself, but if we don't hear from you in a couple seconds, I can go ahead and read your question for you. But Olorotimi, are you there? Okay, you might have trouble with the audio, but his question is, what do you do if those leading the change are compromising with the mainline political and repressive government, as is the case in a society like Nigeria?
30-second answer, right? It's such a complicated question. Wow, that's a really difficult, and there's no cookbook answer to that, because it depends so much, I think, on the details. I don't mean to just evade the question, but I think it depends so much on the details of the situation. If the compromise moves the movement towards some kind of successful victory to gain useful goals, then it may not be entirely bad. But if it's a matter of individuals compromising on their own for personal benefit or something like that, then it can defeat the movement goals. And it depends, I think, again, I don't think compromise in and of itself is necessarily bad, although it's certainly very risky.
Well, Dr. Kurtz, I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation and taking some questions. I know that there are several other people who had typed in their questions, but rest assured they have been recorded, and we will share those with Dr. Kurtz, and hopefully he may have some time to respond to those directly via email, so your questions have not been lost. I also want to encourage those of you who have other general comments or questions about the academic webinar series or about this topic to please email webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we will respond to those as quickly as we possibly can. So I want to thank you all for attending, and to be on the lookout for future webinars as we plan them throughout the year. And we also will be including you in our nonviolent conflict news digest, which is an email that gets sent out twice a week that includes articles and stories from around the world that are related to nonviolent conflict and issues that may lead to nonviolent conflict. So again, thank you, Dr. Kurtz. I don't know if you have any last words that you'd like to share.
Thanks so much. This has been a great opportunity for me. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, everyone who participated. And if you get, again, I would encourage you to let us know if you have ideas about how to refine these and also make it more useful. After all, we're trying to change the world here, and I think that's the reason for our going through these kind of academic exercises. Thanks. Take care.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz, and to everyone. Until next time.
Bye.